I want to thank you all for coming. It's good to see you all. Also, I want to thank a Holy Trinity for making this happen. Largely, it's the entire parish that's been involved. Let's see. So this is. I'm doing this for many reasons. And I had to write them down because I can hardly remember more than 3 things at a time. But make no mistake, I'm doing this for myself. And that turns out that's the first reason I'm doing it. But there are other things that I would like you to absorb, or at least be exposed to while I do this. And my hope is that you become aware of what is possible in terms of dealing with PTSD. And PTSD, of course, is not only with veterans, but most of us, if not all of us, deal with trauma from some time or another. And trauma, especially PTSD type of trauma, is unique. No veteran has the same experience, and we could say that every veteran's trauma is different from another veteran. And I believe that to be true, just like every non-veteran's trauma is unique to them. But and I have to say, because I've been familiar with my PTSD, unfortunately not until we started having a vocabulary to deal with it, which was about 20 years after I was out of the service. And so dealing with PTSD has evolved over the last 30 or 40 years. But I had an opportunity to talk to a psychologist this last April from the VA, and one of my purposes was not only to deal with my own PTSD, but also, coming from a medical background, I was curious what the VA was doing as its best practice for dealing with PTSD. And it turns out it's a way of dealing with irrational fears. Someone who has a fear of flying or stinging insects or walking into a hardware store, whatever. And it's called exposure therapy. And so the current VA treatment for PTSD of veterans is getting them to write down an episode that they found traumatic or stressful, and write it down and then read it. After you've written it down, read it several times a day, and then go back to your psychologist and read it aloud to him. The notion that the psychologist would be a safe person that you can share things with. It's important to be in a safe environment when you're doing this, a place that you feel safe. And then refine your writing down to just narrow it down to the trauma specifically. And you keep doing this, and the belief is that the more time you read about your trauma and speak aloud of your trauma, the emotional intensity that you have in reacting to that trauma becomes less and less. You do not forget the trauma, but your emotional response to it becomes less and less. And this is the VA's current best practice for dealing with PTSD. But because I've already said that everyone who has had trauma Their trauma is unique to them. And even the VA's best practice is not going to work for everybody, because everyone has to find their own way to deal or not deal with their trauma. But anyhow, that's pretty much what I want to say about that. But a third goal is to remind us all of the human cost of war. It's not just a budget item in the defense budget. There is a definite human cost, and you don't have to be killed to be part of that cost. Although that's one way of dealing with it. So a fourth goal is to present in image something that is not fictional. We have all read books, and there's a lot of books written about Vietnam, and some are fictional. One of the recent books that I read is called The Women, and it's a fictional account of a woman who went through nurses training and wanted to get sent to Vietnam so she could be a participant in that. And so the Navy wouldn't take her because she was fresh out of nursing school and didn't have any experience. The Air Corps wouldn't take her because she was fresh out of nursing school and didn't have any experience. The Army accepted her immediately and sent her to 6 weeks of training of how to function in Vietnam, and then sent her to Vietnam, where she was assigned to a field hospital. And she was traumatized because she wasn't well trained. And I have no doubt that this is something that happened, even though the book is fictional. The author says she has interviewed many Army nurses in writing her book. I read the book, and have to say I had different training and a different experience. And but that does not take away anything from that there were other experiences out there. Everyone who went to Vietnam has a unique experience, because most of us went there, like myself, went there as an individual, was assigned to a place and a military unit. And so I came in one day, and all of a sudden I was part of this bigger group, and 1 year later I left. And so that was my experience. Anyway, but you'll be seeing on the screen something that is real. It's not a Hollywood set, and there's very, very little drama in it, I think. Most of it are like tourist shots. It'd be Vietnam as it looked 56 years ago. And the urban setting has got all bulldozed a long time ago, and it's got skyscrapers. And so also I want to remind you that it's a very small part of Vietnam where I was. I was up in I Corps, what it was called, and that was the northernmost military district designated Roman numeral 1, which was often referred to as I Corps, because Roman numeral number 1 is hard to say. But anyhow, so I didn't see a lot of Vietnam, but I was able to get out of my hospital compound and out of the greater Phu Bai compound. Phu Bai compound, when I was there, was the division headquarters of the 3rd Marine Division. This is an opportunity for me to say that I did not join the Marines. In 1964, on the advice of my father, I joined the Navy. So I went through boot camp at Great Lakes because I have many people from my family.
Hit the space bar.
who were in the medical field. My sister, for example, said, Jeannie, raise your hand. And as a nurse, as a career, two of my grandparents were nurses up here, or were doctors up here in International Falls. And their son, Robert, or known as Dr. Hugh, was an ophthalmologist who came up to International Falls and had a small practice up here in addition to his work down in the Twin Cities. And several aunts have been nurses. Anyhow, so I thought I'd give the medical field a try while I was in the Navy, and so they sent me to Hospital Corps School, which trains medical personnel for the Navy. And to the A school, which is called Hospital Corps School, is like LPN training. They teach you how to give a bed bath, how to give shots, how to start IVs, and that kind of thing. And that was 16 weeks long in 1965. By 1968, it was down to 8 weeks. And then because I did well, the Navy offered me another school in the medical practice, which could have been lab technician, x-ray technician, dental technician, mortuary technician, and operating room technician. And I chose operating room technician because I thought that would be interesting. And so that was 6 months long at a Navy hospital on the East Coast. And then from my OR training, I was assigned to a naval hospital up at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is actually in Kittery, Maine. It's a submarine base, but it has a Navy hospital. And then after I was at that hospital, I started there in January. By mid-March, I had orders to go to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Camp Lejeune, North Carolina is a Marine Corps base that trains Marines at Marine Corps boot camp. The field medical service for Navy personnel at Camp Lejeune was kind of like a mini Marine Corps boot camp, except it was only 6 weeks long, and there was no shouting and yelling. So that was, but the emphasis was on physical fitness and finding out about how the Marine Corps works, and there's a whole vocabulary when you're in the Marine Corps. I mean, you need to know what a platoon is, and what a squad is, and what an M60 is, and what M79, and what the 1911 Colt is. How many of you know what the 1911 Colt is? Come on. There you go. It's a 45 automatic, or semi-automatic. It's been used since World War I, and in fact is still in use today. It's a very effective weapon. At that Marine Corps, or at the Field Medical Service, the corpsman, who is mostly unarmed, in Vietnam I was issued the 1911 Colt, which I carried it was next to my bunk, and I rarely carried it. So at Navy, or at the Marine Corps mini boot camp for Navy personnel, I got to fire 2 weapons. It's called FAM fire, or familiarization fire, and we were taken to the range, and we were given, the people on the firing line were issued the 45 semi-automatic and 2 clips. A clip is a tube that holds the ammunition, and each clip had 5 bullets in it. And we were told to face the target, which was about here, to the back wall. Is that 10 yards? Probably not. Anyway, yeah, that might be 30 feet. Anyway, and so we were told to load the weapon, put the clip in and put the slide back and put a bullet in the chamber and aim the weapon at the target, which was an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with a very small red spot. It was kind of the silhouette of head and shoulders of an enemy, perhaps. And it was about the size of a quarter. And it was on the paper against the backdrop. And we were told to fire 5 shots at the target and then change clips. And fire another 5 shots and then put the weapon down. And that was your familiarization fire with your 1911 Colt. And that's exactly what I did. And when my paper came back to me, there were no holes in it. That's it. That's all the training in my 1911. But then we were given an M14, which is the weapon in the Marine Corps at the time in 1966. And the distance was probably twice what we've been using, the 45, and the target was identical. They could have put my other target up, but it was in the and we were lying down this time. And I was able to get, I think, at least 6 holes, put 6 holes in my paper. So it made me feel much more confident, even though I knew I wouldn't be carrying the M14. It was important to know how to use it. Anyhow, and that was a funny episode. But let's see. Okay, so I wanted to talk more about my training, in contrast what the fictional nurse had to deal with. I've no doubt that there were some well-trained nurses in the Army that got to Vietnam, but for this poor nurse fresh out of nursing school, it was not a good experience. And there must have been many of those untrained or unexperienced nurses that went over there. I don't know how many, but anyway. So my training, let's see, I've talked about boot camp, I've talked about basic hospital course school, I've talked about my operating room technician training, which was 6 months, and then the field medical service. So I guess, oh yeah, and after going to field medical service at Camp Lejeune, I came back and worked at the hospital for another 4 months until October. And in October, I had orders to go to Camp Pendleton in California. But in those 5 months that I was at Camp Pendleton, Monday through Friday, I had a job in a warehouse dealing with medical supplies that were being repackaged in a form in a field hospital to replace the field hospital that had already been sent to Vietnam from Camp Pendleton. They were replacing it with stuff directly from manufacturers. And so that was what I did from about 8 until 4, except on Fridays when the chief in charge would let us all go around 1 o'clock or so. But then on Monday through Thursday at 6 o'clock, all of the corpsmen, and there were about 100 of us, had to assemble, and we would go on afternoon maneuvers or evening maneuvers. And the maneuvers would last usually at least 2 hours. And I think the platoon of Marines that were training us had a 5-week cycle because it seemed to be repetitious. And that was because that group of corpsmen, every week there'd be new corpsmen coming in, and people who had been there for a while were being shipped to Vietnam. So I happened to be there, as I say, 5 months, and must have gone through at least 4 cycles or so. And every cycle of about 5 weeks included a 20-mile hike. It included some night maneuvers. And they would divide the corpsmen up into 2 groups when we went on maneuvers. And we did things that Marine Corps did, like set up ambush or be ambushed, or do a sweep through an area, go to a Vietnamese village which they had a small area that had houses and rice paddy and other kinds of things that made it look like a Vietnamese village. And sometimes they would populate the village with Marines dressed up in black pajamas and had the straw hats, and sometimes they would be friendly and sometimes they wouldn't, and you had to work your way through them. So anyhow, so I had a lot of training and a lot of experience before I went to Vietnam. That's the point I'm trying to make. And I guess I've covered that probably more than I need to. Okay, let's start looking at the slides. So this is a picture of the front of the 3rd Medical Battalion, which is the field hospital. This is the front of the field hospital where I was stationed for my year in Vietnam. And it is directly in front of us. We are, I'm shooting this photograph across the parking lot that is at the front of the airport terminal at Phu Bai. Phu Bai would be a suburb of the very large city of Hue, spelled H-U-E, and that's in the northern part of South Vietnam, approximately 75 miles from the DMZ, and north of Da Nang, approximately 55 miles or so, maybe 50. So that's where it was, and the parking lot is paved. Here it looks like mud, but under the mud there's pavement, and it looks like it's in the monsoon season because it's all wet. Anyhow, so that's where that was, and now these are just photos taken from a tourist, myself. So lower your expectations. And it's on a 30-second time. This is taken from a C-130 flying south from Phu Bai to Da Nang along the coast of Vietnam. And Vietnam is a beautiful country. This is at the airport of Da Nang, and that's a F-5 taking off. F-5 is made by Northrop, and my mother's cousin worked on the engineering of that. And this is a F-4 and the C-130. These are all at Da Nang, and this is what the Da Nang airport looked like in 67 and 68. This is Marble Mountain. On top is radar and communication. And this is just outside the airport. This is driving through, we could say it's a suburb of the city of Da Nang. The Marines called it Dog Patch. There it is. Yeah, the Marines call that little strip of structures dog. This is downtown Da Nang. And this is all gone, been replaced with huge apartment buildings and business buildings. Da Nang is a big city. And I'm probably sitting in the back of a large truck, like a 2.5-ton truck. And this is a mansion, I would say, or demonstrating the French influence. Vietnam was a colony of France for over 100 years. And this is also, I believe, from the French, who had to deal with a revolution that kicked the French out in about 1950.
54 was the Dien Phu.
Thank you. And this is the river that flows next to Da Nang. This is public transportation. and this is what you might see anywhere, carrying passengers from place to place. And this particular shot, this is the driveway going to a Navy hospital. And I'm at the Navy hospital to see if I can get some supplies for my Marine Corps hospital. Because for a period of time, for about 8 months, I was in charge of ordering supplies for the OR, among other duties. And the catalog, the Marine Corps catalog, was printed in approximately 1953. And so the addendum had some of the modern things like disposable gloves and plastic disposable syringes and plastic or disposable needles. But all of our, many of our physicians were fresh out of their surgical residency. And surgical residencies are all in institutions of higher learning that are very large and have big budgets and can buy all the new latest developments, scientific developments. And so when these doctors fresh out of their residency couldn't find what they are used to using, they would tell the scrub technician that was passing them instruments what they would like to see, and would it be possible to get some of that. And the scrub tech would be fast to point out me as being the person that could help them. And I loved them coming to me because I could always start off with, Doc, you know, you're in a combat zone. We don't have that stuff. And they would scratch it and said, well, geez, can't you get some of that? How do you? And I said, yeah, let me see what I can do. And I knew, because I was a Navy guy, that I could get stuff from the Navy. Even though I was in the Marine Corps, the Navy are pretty friendly to and I was a sailor in the Marine Corps, which is kind of hard to fathom. But did you get that Navy term, fathom? Okay, that's all right. Anyhow, so the two places that I could go that were Navy facilities, one was the Navy hospital in Da Nang, and there was also a Navy hospital in Saigon, but that was out of reach. But the other Navy facility was the hospital ship that was offshore. And the hospital ship was much closer, usually within 10 miles ashore, and I could get there because I was E5, which is equivalent to a sergeant and had some responsibilities. I could write orders to myself to get on a helicopter or Huey and get out to the hospital ship, where I would take care of the important things first. I would go get an ice cream from the hospital Gidong, and I would often find a place to sleep on the deck. And then I would go to the operating room and ask to see the senior technician, and I would never go empty-handed. I would carry a grocery bag, just a brown paper sack, that had some treasures or trinkets that I think they might appreciate. It might be a box of sea rations, which would be foreign to a sailor aboard ship. It might be a jungle utility top that might have a bullet hole in it. And the other item that was always welcome was something called a poncho liner, which is a nylon quilt that has a very thin batting between two sheets of camouflage nylon. And when I see one, I'll point it out. Say, this is a Navy, or this is a poncho liner. And I would be quick to admit that perhaps the only good that came out of Vietnam War was the poncho liner. And I did bring some home. And even to this day, if I need to take a nap and I don't want to crawl into bed, I will just kick my shoes off and grab my poncho liner out of the dresser drawer and curl up under the poncho liner and feel completely safe and in a comfort zone and have a nice nap. So let's look for poncho liners. Okay, the next shot will be a picture of the Navy hospital, which I want you to keep in mind in contrast to the Marine Corps Field Hospital. These are metal Quonset huts, and I think they had as many as 12 operating rooms and enough room for a couple thousand patients. These two are operating room technicians in the 1st Medical Battalion of the 1st Marine Division. And they are significant because they were in Vietnam the same time I was. This guy, his name is Don Schwartz, and he was from Scranton, Pennsylvania. And he and I were in operating room technician school for 6 months, and we were also in Portsmouth, New Hampshire together for 8 months, or 9 months, 8 months it was. And so I knew him real well. I'd been to his house in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and been skiing with him. And I think, Jeannie, he was, didn't we spend the night at your house and have breakfast? I think we did. Anyway, and this guy, I can't remember his name, he and I worked in the warehouse together. He was with me for 5 months when we were at Camp Pendleton. And he invited me home to Easter. And his folks had a cabin in the mountains between Los Angeles and San Francisco. So while I was in Da Nang, I went over to see these guys. And I can't remember how I knew they were there. I must have corresponded with them. Don Schwartz is the only person, well, no, there was another technician. I've only spoke to 2 of the technicians that I was assigned with in Vietnam. This is at the USO Club in Da Nang. This is China Beach. Did anyone ever watch the TV series China Beach?
Yes.
And someone recommended that I watch it. And again, it was about Army nurses in an Army hospital. And their experience was different than mine. No doubt there were nuggets of truth in the fictional account, but I don't think any of it was filmed at the actual China Beach. But anyhow, it was a nice, I never thought of bringing my swimming suit, so I didn't go swimming. But it was a place where anyone who wanted to go on R&R without leaving the country could go to China Beach and stay for a week or 10 days. And this is outside of barracks, not far from the Da Nang airport. It's a place where you might stay if you were going to fly out the next morning. And this is to show water buffalo that were used for agricultural purposes like plowing and so forth. Here we are back at Phu Bai, and this is getting ready for something that I did twice, and this is to go on a MedCap mission. MedCap was Military Aid to Civilians program that most medical units, Army and Navy certainly, I can't speak for the Air Force, but they would send out a couple of doctors, a handful of corpsmen or medics, and they would go out and set up a clinic in perhaps a spare room at a church, or a spare room at an orphanage, or perhaps in an open market or something. And they, 6 days a week, they went out on MedCap. And on Monday, they went to the same 2 or 3 places that they had been the previous Monday. So the people in the area could have some reliability on when they were coming back. And if I were an enemy, I would think I would, if I wanted to ambush a small unit or capture medical personnel, it would be a place to do that. But in the year that I was there was no kind of confrontation or thing like that. So because I was curious what a med cap would be like. And sometimes when the operating room was not busy, I scheduled myself to go on a med cap just as a tourist. And so the next few shots will be of me being a tourist, while the doctors were working, and the other corpsmen were helping the doctors, and the handful of Marines were kind of keeping a secure perimeter. This has got to be a corpsman because he's not carrying a weapon. So the two rooms being used in this church are down there toward the end. And this is me being a tourist. This is a grotto outside the church. This is what the church, so I have entirely too many photos of the church, but it was interesting. And the church, in fact, was demolished during the Tet Offensive when Hue was attacked by the North Vietnamese. And the church, being a significant building, was believed to be have snipers or people directing artillery fire for the enemy. I don't know if it was rebuilt. I did get into Hue a couple of times with Medcap.
So when you say it was totally destroyed, it was by our firepower?
Say again?
When you say it was totally destroyed, it was totally destroyed by the Americans?
Well, yeah, by probably Americans, but there were also army of, let's just say it was destroyed by Americans. Here's it, and you can see the age range is quite big. And this did not happen while I was there, but it does remind us that there was no place that was particularly safe from all hazard. This is an open market in Hue, and the products were quite varied, and you could get just about anything you wanted, I think, in the market. And this is downtown Hue, along the river. There's a river off to the left. And I love the old cars from the French, from the French colony, which will be coming up here shortly. There we go. And there's U.S. Petroleum. The city of Hue, I don't know what the population was in 1967 when I was there. This is a temple along the road. I think the majority of Vietnamese people embrace Buddhism as the primary religion of the country. But there's a strong, at least in '67, there was a strong Catholic presence as well. And this is me in a Huey helicopter going out to the hospital ship to get some specialized suture or other kind of equipment that I hope they have that I can get. And this is a nice quiet part of the deck where I might have taken a nap. Or I might have struck up a conversation with a sailor who was doing sailor kind of work. And this is me with my bag of goodies. And look at that, there's a Navy nurse. And this is me standing over here too shy to go over and say hello. This is me being too shy. So these, as I say, I made it out to the hospital ship twice, and it's pretty much the same deal. This is us flying back to Fubai, coming in over there's a sandbank away from shore, an offshore sandbank, and I think it's likely that these are graves and tombs and so forth, because they're a little bit, even though they're little small squares of territory, they're a little bit different than rice paddies. Here's the rice paddies in the front here. And this is that sand island, it's a long island offshore. And these are rice paddies that are flooded. This in the previous shot, the rice paddies were dry for the most part, well, like these. My journeys out to the hospital ship were approximately 6 weeks apart. Might have been 6 or 7 weeks apart. And here you'll see this temple in one of the later slides, because it's within sight of the perimeter, the wire perimeter around the greater Fubai compound. And here's a bunker along the perimeter. And I want you to take note of all of this vegetation. Here's that. Okay, and this is a fortification built by the French. It was alongside the railroad tracks, which is a depression between here and there. But it looks like there's a gun on top. That looks like a .50 caliber. So there were times where the operating room was not busy. I don't believe there was a 24 hours a period where we had none of the operating rooms working. There was often 1 or 2 rooms going, rarely at night, mostly during the day. And all of my photographs in and around the operating room area were taken during those periods where there was very little going on. If the operatives were busy, like 3 or more rooms being busy, I wouldn't even bring my camera because I'd be helping out, helping change over rooms or scrubbing in and so forth. The previous picture had some towers in it. They were around along the wire. And in the front here, you'll see another shot. This is an artillery emplacement that was inside the greater Fubai compound, and these are 155 howitzers, which is a pretty big gun. I believe the range is more than 12 miles. And these were a sound you got familiar with, so you could sleep through it, because often they fired at night, and in your subconscious mind, oh yeah, that's artillery. Those are the 155s. Artillery is going out. Here's more of those towers in the distance. And these metal roof buildings and screen sides, that was the common hooch where personnel slept. Here's another bunker with different weapons on the sandbags. There were no Marines in that bunker at the time I walked by. Here's another item that was along the perimeter. These are twin 40 millimeter. If you ever remember those World War II movies of the Navy with ships big ships that had gun emplacements where the guns were going like this, boom, 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 boom. That was the 40 millimeter anti-aircraft gun. Well, sometime after the Korean War, they put the 40 millimeter on a small track. I think we had a special name for them, but I can't remember what it might be.
Duster?
Yep.
Duster.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. And again, look at the foliage around. We're about to come to a time when I can show you where they sprayed Agent Orange around the compound. So you can see the barbed wire here in front. This is what it looked like after Agent Orange. All the foliage is gone. And after the foliage died, they took a plow and scraped it clean. And this is me flying my propeller aircraft. I never flew propeller aircraft. Here's the C-130 taking off, and our operating rooms are. This is the Hue Fubai Air Terminal, and this is right across from triage of our hospital. So whenever the airport was taking rocket fire or incoming mortar fire, it was pretty close to us when it landed. At one point there were some rockets or some mortar rounds that hit in the airport area, but they were close enough to send fragments over into triage. There was nobody in triage at the time except for some corpsmen who were probably lying on the floor. But it incentivized the building of a blast wall outside of triage, just to reduce the potential of getting shrapnel. This is without the blast wall. The blast wall was in the first photograph we saw with the big red cross in it. And they took runway matting, which is approximately 2 feet wide, and they built a holder for sand, and they filled it with sand, and it was about 8 feet tall. Let's look at this for a little bit. This is a water tank. It's a rubberized water tank, and it has 2 immersible heaters in it, and it heated water for the showers, which were in front. And this is a plane flown by Air America. Air America was managed by the CIA, and flew civilian and CIA operatives up and down the coast of Vietnam. Let's see, what is that? That was, okay, this is more Phu Bai, the airport, I mean. And this is before the Air Force built barracks across the field here. And they built the barracks 2 stories high, which is a very bad idea, it turns out. I could have, even standing here in those days, I said, oh, that's a bad idea. Because for those of you who are familiar with explosions, the blast is directed upward. And so unless you're down low, you're liable to catch some or much of that stuff that goes in the air, which includes metal pieces of shrapnel and might include dirt and rocks. And so when that area did get rockets and mortars, I think it was rockets anyhow, they brought many casualties over to our operating room. And because it was during when that the rockets hit those barracks, it was during the monsoon, and so many of the people in the Air Force were sleeping in their down sleeping bags. And so for some of the wounded that we got coming from those barracks, we were pulling feathers out of their wounds. But that was not unusual, because in combat in the jungle, often the wounds, whatever comes through the skin brings dirt, sometimes foliage, sometimes clothing. So all the wounds were dirty. All the wounds would have been infected without treatment. And so that's something that we were always well aware of. This is more of the type of aircraft that were stationed at Bugai during those years, mostly 67. And this is Vietnamese fast food down here in the corner. I never ate there, but the smells coming there were, some were delightful, some were saying, oh my God, who could eat that? But my wife's family, my wife who's here tonight, her family in 1975 brought 5 Vietnamese children into their home, and they stayed for several months, and so my wife, when she was home, had to share a room with 2 Vietnamese kids that were younger than her. The oldest child was my wife's age, and she had just started at St. Olaf in 1975. And she would go back to school and tell her classmates that she had better accommodation at school than she had at home. Because at school she was just had one other bunkmate, and at home she had 2. So what we're looking at here is the hospital compound. And these buildings over here are hooches for the enlisted staff. In the background up here, you'll see hooches for officers. In the distance here, these warehouses over here are medical supply. And over here is, we get toward the hospital, and there's patient wards, a long row of patient wards. And our entertainment center, which we'll see eventually. And then further to the left here is hospital administration and laboratory and pharmacy and 2 dental technician or 2 dental hooches. And then on the way to the mess hall was the graves registration, where all of the dead were brought and washed off and put into clean body bags and sent down to Da Nang for embalming or whatever they did. Okay, so this is the commanding officer's office, and this is administration, where you go to get your list of things you have to do when you're checking in, and your list of things you have to do when you're checking out. That is when you're going back to the States. And I think this is personnel. And then further down the line is the pharmacy and lab and so forth. And over here's triage, right here. And next to triage is X-ray in a Quonset hut. And then next to X-ray is 2 operating rooms, is our central supply, where all of the operating room's techs worked when they were not in the operating room. Because every day we had laundry that had been sent out the previous day, came back in the morning, and so we had to deal with laundry, fold it up, make new operating room linen packs, and wrap stuff in linens that we wanted to be sterilized. And then comes operating room 3 and 4, and then the area between the 2 operating rooms, and then 2 operating rooms 1 and 2, and then our water tank. It's all more than you needed to know. This is Air Force stuff over here. And here's a sign I thought was funny at the time. Not so funny anymore. And this is what my hooch looked like. And just a corrugated roof. I was in 2 different hooches during my stay there. The first hooch I went into when I checked in as a new guy, FNG, had 2 holes in the roof up near the peak. Before I got there, someone had been cleaning their 1911 Colt a couple hooches away, and he forgot to clear the chamber, and he let loose a round that put one hole in his own hooch, and then the next 2 hooches had 2 holes. Nobody was injured, but these 2 guys happened to be people who were in operating room technician school with me. There were only 5 men and 2 women in that group of OR techs back in Chelsea, in north of Boston. And so I was quite surprised to see these guys, because I hadn't seen any of them since we left OR school. And all of a sudden I'm in Vietnam, and 3 of them are up here at Fubai. And I was the 4th one, and the 5th one you already met, who was down at Da Nang. So here, at some point, because we never felt very safe in our bunker that was above ground, we thought, well, digging below ground's a much better idea. And it was for about 3 months until the monsoon came. And then if you could look down in there, and somebody actually went down in there, the water was up to his waist. And so it was not a place you'd want to spend any time, even if there were mortars and rockets falling on the airfield. But I filled a lot of sandbags while I was there. Oh, look, there's somebody. And look at my ribs are showing.
So is your red hair.
Yes. And this is another guy wearing black pajamas, and he was not Vietnamese. He was one of the OR techs, and he was in OR tech school with me. And this is every hooch had 1 or 2 Vietnamese women who would wash their clothes, shine their boots, and sweep the sand out. You can see the sides on most of these were just made of screen, and so when it was windy, the sand would come in and cover everything to a little bit. So the people that worked in the hospital compound, we never saw after the Tet Offensive. But in a mass grave outside of Hue, there were approximately 3,000 Vietnamese who had worked for the United States. So this is inside the hooch, and this is the first woman who took care of me in the first hooch I was in. The reason I changed hooches, as I was saying, there were 2 holes that leaked up toward the top. Anyhow, during the monsoons, the women would catch their laundry water off the roof, and that was usually enough to do their laundry. When it was not monsoon, they had to go across to next to the airport terminal was a well where water could be drawn from the well and have to be carried over to do laundry. And her name was Trun Tin To. And quite disrespectfully, we called her Rin Tin Tin. You're 24 and you do some silly stuff. This woman brought in her daughter on a Sunday, and she made a lunch in the hooch for the members of the hooch. And she did that just because she wanted to, I think. And here's the well, and being used to draw water from the well. I don't know if anyone saw it, there wasn't much of a chance. Is a GI helmet. I thought that was interesting.
There's a poncho liner.
Was that a question?
I said, isn't that a poncho liner on that?
Oh, poncho liner, exactly, thank you. There was a poncho, we'll see it again. There, this is a poncho liner.
Oh.
It's like a wonderful quilt. But look at us, all of these pictures of OR techs sitting around. The operating room was not busy every day. There would be surgery of some kind every day. And I believe that's true. Every day there was something. But there were many days when there were no surgeries after noon, for example, until the next morning. And so there was time to read. I did a lot of reading. I played a lot of chess. And ironically, the game of Risk was very popular. Who remembers Risk? And did anyone play that? I played a lot of Risk. And world domination, I mean, you just have to step out your door to see what was really happening. Well, let's see, here we go. This, for a period of time, was MySpace. And we put up this grass matting, or matting, and when I was on MedCap, one of our MedCap visits was at an orphanage. And in the orphanage, they were weaving this matting. And they were also weaving cotton. It looked like sheeting, cotton fabric that was white. On machines that seemed just a very short distance or a very short time from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it was all mechanical stuff. The shuttle being hit back and forth by a wooden hammer, if you will. But let's look at this stuff for a little while. It must be summertime, where the temperature inside the hooch would always be at least 10 degrees warmer than outside. And here's my straw hat that I had just because I liked them and I thought they were typical Vietnam. And this is my book collection that was constantly changing because you would trade books with people who had interesting stuff to read. Here's my basin for washing hands and face and shaving. And here's my clean hat. And my pillow covered with a pillowcase, and my rubber mattress covered with a white sheet borrowed from hospital linen supply. And over here's my helmet, my flak jacket, and here's my belt, and my holster with my 1911 Colt, and a flashlight, I think. It was good to have a flashlight when the power went out in the operating room, which it did, not very often. But you didn't want to go to duty, you didn't want to work in the operating room at night without your flashlight. And here's my canteen cup attached by a coat hanger, a metal coat hanger down to my metal tray and my knife, fork, and spoon. And all of this stuff had to be turned out or turned back to the mess hall when you shipped out or when you went home. So you had to hang on to it. Oh, there's another flashlight right there. Look at that. Let's see if we can see another poncho liner. Also, because people were coming and going all the time, for the operating room, there'd be a technician, maybe one or two technicians going home during a month, but you'd get one and two technicians coming in. And so part of my job, in addition to ordering supplies, was to do orientation and any training that the new technician needed. So here's the same old stuff, although now I have, the point is, people coming and going, there was a lot of stuff that you had in your hooch area, or that you had accumulated, stuff that you could not take back in your bag. And it would certainly include your weapons, because that didn't belong to you. There was a refrigerator that got passed from generation to generation. I don't know when it was purchased, but my hooch had like a dorm refrigerator, a little small thing, and you could keep pop in it and keep anything cold that you wanted to keep cold. And we also had a hot box that somebody had built early in their stay there that had, it was a little bit bigger than the dorm refrigerator, but it had an incandescent bulb in the bottom and then holes for ventilation. So if you had something that you did not want to mold during the monsoon season, like maybe you had a set of slacks and a shirt that you were going to wear on R&R, and you didn't want it to get moldy, you put it in the hot box, and the heat of the incandescent bulb would provide the ventilation and keep the thing dry. So here is a poncho liner, and it looks like I might have a wool blanket on the bottom of my bed there. And here I have 2 canteen cups, and this thing here is a cup warmer. It wasn't a little one, it was kind of an industrial cup warmer. And so during the Tet Offensive, when I was eating my sea rations at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I would put the entree into the cup and put water enough to cover the small can and drop the cup warmer in there, and that would bring the water to a boil, and I would have a hot entree. And that was the only hot meal I had during the Tet Offensive, when I was only getting 2 meals a day. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, about more likely 3:30, and then at midnight. And that's where the Spam sandwiches came from. Every midnight and we were working, let's see, I've told this so many times. When Tet happened, around the 1st of February of 1968, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong coordinated attacks on most of the urban areas of Vietnam. And it was approximately 6 weeks of intense combat. And at our field hospital, we started receiving casualties around the 1st of February. And we didn't know at that time that it was going to be called the Tet Offensive. So we kept the ORs going 24 hours a day. And by the time we kept the operating rooms going, all the operating rooms going, for 36 hours, some bad stuff started happening. People falling asleep on their feet and so forth. So our commanding officer, who you meet later, shut us down. We stopped taking casualties that arrived at our door. They would have to go out to the hospital ship, or they would have to go further south to Da Nang for 24 hours. And he told all of the departments to get some rest, divide up into 3 groups, get your shifts. And so every person in the hospital was working 16 hours a day for approximately 45 days. And my particular shift was from 4 in the afternoon until 8 in the morning. And at 8 in the morning, I was not at all interested in food. I would go straight to my bunk and go to sleep. And then I would wake up at about 3 or so and have I've already talked about that. So if working in the operating room at midnight, the mess hall would bring over what are called mid-rats, which are midnight rations, and they would bring enough for intensive care staff and triage staff and the x-ray and for the operating room. And what that would look like is 3 or 4 loaves of white bread and a bottle or 2 of ketchup, glass bottles. And then this olive drab, who knows olive drab? You know, it's a color.
Sea rations.
Kind of a green-brown color.
Yep.
And it was about 18 inches long and about 4.5 by 4.5 inches. And it had a key on the top, and you could wrap it around. And if you were to pick up that can and read it, it would say, spiced ham, made by Hormel Company. And there it was, every midnight, a taste of Minnesota. And so my second of 2 meals of the day was a Spam sandwich, which I would vary some days with ketchup, some days without it, just for variation. And so I hope you all stop at the table and grab just even one of those tiny sandwiches, just to think about that as your midnight ration for 45 days. And I want to say that I brought several of these poncho liners home, and as I've told other people here, if I want to lie down for a nap, I just have to kick my shoes off and lie on the bed and reach in the drawer next to the bed for my poncho liner, and I had no problem fall asleep. It's just a wonderful feeling. Anyhow, so when people would leave stuff behind, it was with the understanding that somebody else would take use of that. And this is the hot box, which had a lock on it, which I don't know why, because several people used it. But I had a desk, and I could sit and write letters, and I had my lamp. And so here's a lot of chess being played, as I said. This is Joe the Bear Baracus. He's an OR tech. And I can no longer remember where he's from. But he's a big guy. This is him fully clothed. And I want to point out here that behind him is a wall of sandbags that was outside of our Quonset hut operating room. So we had some protection. And to leave the operating room when there were rockets and mortars falling was to step out of a safe place. And during the 12 months I was there, we did have 2 rockets hit the hospital, not at the same time. And we had numerous mortar rounds fall in near the medical warehouses. So it's not as though we were totally safe. But you see his collar device on one side, and then he's got, and these are 4 OR technicians sitting on both sides of our battalion commander. So this is the main boss. And this is an operating room technician. And this is some other guy, I don't know, but the 4x4. So we had some entertainment. And we did get some, this is a picnic. And we must have had 3 or 4 picnics during the year. The beer that we usually got at our picnics and in our enlisted men clubs were in that red can with a black label. See that? That's it's called Black Label beer, and it's from some brewery on the East Coast. This is my boss. He was the E6, and for most of the time, for about 6 months, I was the only E5, and so I was his right-hand man, as it were. or I was second in charge, and he allowed me to do everything that he didn't want to do, which includes ordering supplies, which I've already talked about, and doing orientation and training, which I enjoyed doing. I also had to do a monthly weapon and uniform inspection to make sure everyone had a clean weapon and that they had at least one intact uniform that they could wear. And it looks like everyone's got a clean uniform on here, but anyhow, so I did monthly inspections between the months of September when I started until Tet Offensive, because after Tet Offensive arrived and after it was over, I never held another inspection. And wasn't asked to hold any more inspections anyway. So here we are being entertained at some place, and there's a stage off to the left that where all the entertainment took place. Bob Hope never came up. Raquel Welch, only in my dreams. Okay, here's something that happened that we will only speak among ourselves. These stakes fell off the back of a truck that was making a delivery to the officers' club. And they wound up, this might have been my hooch, it might have been somebody else's hooch, but we did eat these. They did not go to waste.
Ketchup.
Doesn't that look fun? Oh, it was a good time. Here, more entertainment. And because our compound was not tightly secure, I mean, the airport open to the public was just right across the parking lot. And so anyone who was around that heard the singing or whatever could come in and watch, and they were welcome. This is an example of a group. There were 5 women. One you can't see because she's behind the keyboard over here. They did covers of popular rock and roll of the period. And it was well received. They were very cute. They were incredibly talented. And here's our commanding officer being invited up on stage to do a little twist and shout with these cute young ladies. And here's some Vietnamese army that were stationed close by, came in to watch, and they were welcome. And this is what the Vietnamese ward looked like, and there might have been 2 of those. The Vietnamese were separate from the military personnel, and their wounds and ailments were different. And this small structure here is the barber shop, where you could get a wonderful haircut, and for an additional nickel or maybe a dime, you could get a scalp and neck massage from the barber. Of course, he appreciated a tip, but it wasn't required. And I think this is the manager of the Vietnamese ladies, a USO guy that brought them from place to place. And I have no idea who this person is, but obviously she's important. She's wearing white boots that are made for walking, and so if any of you know who that celebrity is, and I know she's a celebrity because she's being escorted by one of our surgeons. And this is, here's a different group that in addition to being musical, and here's a trombone guy who's probably important, I can't remember his name. But anyhow, these guys are watching. And over here we have, these are M14s, which tell you that this happened before June or July of '67, because that's when all of these M14s were collected and the M16s were passed out. So this is what, when I was in the mini Marine Corps boot camp that I talked about, this is what I got to shoot. And again, 2 magazines, 5 shots, shoot them downrange, and do not point the weapon anywhere else but downrange, or you will be in big doo-doo. And this is a projection booth because we did have movies. I don't remember movies often, maybe twice a month, but there was basketball, and this reminds us that there was time off if you worked in the operating room, because if the operating room wasn't busy and you'd done all your chores in the morning, you might be done with your duties unless called back after lunch. And volleyball was popular. Even I played volleyball. But I can't jump, so I didn't play basketball. And this pole climbing was by somebody who's probably drank more than their share of their beer ration. Because this is a wooden pole, and all those splinters were pointed up. Yeah, think about that for a few minutes. And you could always get a weed whip out of the landscaping closet with rakes and shovels and weed whips, and you could whack the weeds. Okay, here's a sad event that happened while I was there. A C-130 in a rainstorm came down a little bit low and clipped the top of this bunker and broke apart and crashed, and its cargo, in addition to Marines and corpsmen, had a road grader inside that was, of course, it was attached for shipping, but when the plane crashed, it broke loose and squashed it. So I can't remember how many humans were in there. I think it was, I don't know, 60. But there was a lot. But there were 17 people killed, either by the machine damage or the crash breaking apart, or the fire that followed. But they were, here in the background you can see the top of the airport, and in this group of trees is where the hospital was. So in the middle of the night, that would be pretty much the whole OR crew would be turned out to go to work. And this is pretty amazing. I took a lot of pictures.
Robin, were those C-130s used for medevacs?
Were they used for medevacs?
Yes, they were often used for medevac, particularly from Khe Sanh and Dong Ha and up near the DMZ where they had airports. There was a runway at Khe Sanh, for example, and Khe Sanh was under siege from, I think, might have been as early as November '67 until the end of Tet. So it was a great defeat for the North Vietnamese army, because the bombers and the air superiority just kept their numbers low enough so they didn't feel confident in attacking Quezon, the base. And Quezon was really more than one base. They had smaller, let's say, fortresses on several of the close-by hilltops. But when I was there, they never took any of them. They never could quite muster enough strength or whatever. Okay, this is the South Vietnamese Army getting ready to receive the then president of South Vietnam, Nguyen Cao Ky. And he brought his entourage up to Phu Bai Airport to inspect the troops that were stationed nearby. And as a courtesy, he walked across the parking lot and paid a visit to 3rd Medical Battalion and was given a brief tour. And he stopped into the Vietnamese wards and said hello to his people. And he also exchanged pleasantries with other wounded. And this is part of his entourage. And this is Nguyen Cao Ky, the president of South Vietnam, in our triage. And I believe our commanding officer is over here someplace. And this gate over here is through where most of our patients were brought by airplane or helicopter. And they were brought across the parking lot to, and here's somebody. So casualties coming to our field hospital, most of them, especially the ones who went through surgery, were only there for 3 or 4 days. And then they were put on airplanes and shipped to hospitals, mostly out of Vietnam. A few might have gone down to the Navy hospital at Da Nang, but many were sent to Clark Air Force Base that had a very large hospital in the Philippines. And some were sent to Okinawa, which had a large military hospital, Navy hospital, I should say. And some were sent to Japan, to a Navy hospital. If any of you have read the book 365 Days, it's written by, I think, a pediatrician who was drafted and sent to Japan to work in the hospital, and he's a Minnesota guy. And it's about his, as a Navy doctor, his experience working in that Navy hospital, working with casualties from Vietnam. Okay, so this is when I got there, this is the hallway between the 4 operating rooms that we had at that time in '67. And so this is the deep sinks where doctors and the foremen could wash their hands before entering the operating rooms. And then later, when we were about to receive 2 more operating rooms to give us 6, they put this double door in that hallway between these operating rooms, and they put a sidewalk out to the other 2 operating rooms, which were of a design that's still being used today, wherever military hospitals have to be created. This is my supply guy, who was a Navy corpsman, and he's the guy I went to over to get supplies from our medical supply. This is interesting. This is our autoclave shed. Being an operating room, we needed a lot of sterile linens and sterile equipment and instruments and so forth. And all of our instruments were autoclaved in this area, and this is made of metal and concrete, because the autoclaves that we had to start with, and we only had 4 to start with, were fueled by white gas, or more likely leaded gas, like automobile gas. And you can see these fuel tanks down here, empty or full. And the fuel was not stored inside where the autoclaves were. How many of you had made use of a Coleman stove? Come on.
Yep.
Okay. You know where you fill up the tank and you pump it full of air? Well, that was similar in mechanics to what was heating up the autoclaves to create the steam to sterilize the linen pads. And over the course of my year there, you will see 4 different autoclaves. One that they would have used in World War II and Korea, and another one used between, this is an Ortec, and he's a lot smarter than he looks. But it's his week in the autoclave room. And the autoclave room was not a punishment, but everyone who was not an E5 picked me to be the E5. I never had to do this, but I had to inspect it periodically and make sure they had enough fuel, enough water, and things were getting done. And I don't think I made the assignments here. I think the E6 made the assignments. So everyone had to take a week at a time doing this, and it was just rotated through. And whenever a new guy came, as soon as he was done with orientation, he got a week in the autoclave room. So, and take a look, let's see what those autoclaves look like. Look at that baby. Here's your fuel tank. There's the little stem that you pumped air into the fuel tank. And another place you added water. Oh, back here you added water. And this would have been designed after Korea, but before Vietnam. And then when Vietnam started, I mean, the fuel tank that you've seen is now enclosed, but the principle is the same. It's a liquid fuel with air for compression and to move the fuel into the burning element. And then we got this modern one. This was designed probably shortly before Vietnam, but we didn't reach us until, well, the middle of the summer probably. I arrived in April, and I think this came probably in August. And this folds up nicely and can be shipped without having to build a new cabinet around us. And also this rascal, you could plug into 220 and just avoid the whole fuel explosion. No explosions happened while I was there. There was a couple brief fires as fuel spills, and you burn off the fuel and you can get back to work. But you can see this is a concrete and metal building, except for the frames holding the screen in and the roof up. And then later on, when we got our 2 new operating rooms, I'll show you what that looked like. It looked very much like this, except with a bigger cabinet. Okay, now we're going to look inside the operating room. And this is just stuff on the bulletin board. A calendar to remind us that we've all got a rotation date. We all get to go home. And this is our workroom that was between X-ray and operating rooms 3 and 4. And I say every day we had chores to do, and so that was the beginning of our day. And it all depended on how much surgery had been the day before, but there was linen to be folded, and it was a variety of linen. Some of it were gowns, some of it were hats, some of it were scrub suits, top and bottoms. and there was sheets that were used for drapes, and so there was always stuff to be done. And everything that was sterilized was either wrapped in paper or linen. So dressing changes, minor surgery sets. But if we were done by noon, everyone can go play chess or take a walk around the perimeter, which I enjoy doing. Sometimes I take people with me, or text other people who are curious. But these guys look like they're getting ready to go into surgery, probably putting on scrub tops. This guy called me out of the blue and wanted to talk, and said he had a place up near Ely. And so Becky and I went down and visited him, and we had a wonderful conversation. And Becky and I, they fed us lunch, and we spent the afternoon, and Becky took him into town to have supper. And so just to continue our conversation. It was a wonderful conversation. But somehow the conversation turned toward politics, and we discovered we were not compatible. But anyhow, I never saw him again. But here you can see stuff that's been sterilized, some in paper, everything else in linen, and disposable sutures, and disposable needles, stuff. Anyhow, so this is, it's not sterile on the outside, of course, but you put it on the table and you start taking the wraps off, and what's inside is sterile. So look at this very primitive OR table. Not many adjustments there. Concrete floor, drain under the table. Just a floor drain. Oh, geez. Are we done in there? I guess so. What I wanted to show you, it's worth a look. I could go back. That's too late. All right, we will just let it go. Okay, here we're getting our two operating rooms. Along with the operating rooms came 2 patient wards, and the ground had to be flattened, and our surveyor's transit had to be used to put down these 2 concrete slabs that the patient wards were going to be put on. But other things I want to talk about here is our mess hall over here to the left, and this garbage can is full of boiling water where you dip that's why your mess kit or your metal tray is on the coat hanger. So you drop it in there because you wanted to sterilize it before you put food on it. It also got the sand off and any rats that might have run over it in the night. Because we did have rats, I only ever saw them at night, and we made a real effort to keep food out of our living environment. So that helped a lot. But when you were coming back from the shower, for example, with your towel around your middle, you would often see rats running from one place to another. So let's talk about some more of these. What are these little houses here? These are all outhouses. And over here is for the enlisted lower ranks. And then this smaller one is for non-commissioned officers, and that is E7 through E8. And chiefs, they were like, yeah, they were E7 and through E9, actually, I think. And over here, so what happens? these are outhouses where you went to go to the bathroom. And this is probably a 4-holer or 5-holer, and the smaller ones would have fewer holes in it. But when you sat to do your business fell into a half of a 55-gallon drum, which you can see, well, maybe here, and maybe over here to the left. But then those were removed once a day and replaced with an empty one. And the ones that had your business in it were taken over here, and fuel oil, like kerosene or jet fuel, would be put in that drum with your business, and it would be burned. But on the way to the mess hall, you'd be walking right by that. And you wonder, who does the planning here? And the other interesting part, I talked about Graves registration that would respectfully wash off the dead, the casualties. And that was on the other side of this road on the way to the mess hall. And they never shut their door because they had the fans going, and anyway. So who does the planning? And these are medical supply over here. I pointed them out at a different time, I'm sure. Okay, look at these 2 patient wards that were going up. This stuff is rubberized nylon. Nylon that's been coated with rubber, and it's made into half of an inner tube. And it gets inflated with air, and each one of these inner tubes can stand by itself, can support this air and heating thing up at the top. And there was a floor put in. It was also made of the same material, but foam, kind of like a non-compressible foam. And this is the sidewalk that goes from the 4 old operating rooms to the new operating rooms. And this is our operating room water tower, which I had to inspect once a week to make sure we had enough water and that there were no leaks or punctures. And these are the operating rooms. They come in these boxes, these shipping containers that are put on a concrete slab. And I believe these are all Marines from the engineering department. Anyhow, they knew what they were doing. This was not the first time they set up this thing, although to see them all there with their hands on their hips, you wonder if it was. And look at the technology, for heaven's sakes. The wonderful thing about the patient wards and that inflatable rubber was that if it was hit or by an explosive round with shrapnel and whatnot, the rubberized nylon would absorb part of that energy. And the other thing about that was, being made of rubber and nylon, it would not create more fragments, which if the munitions hit the concrete, for example, or hit a wooden structure, it creates. So this is the inside of the modern operating room, with spotlights and clean surfaces and stuff. And the technicians love being assigned to the new ones because it was always a little bit cooler. The air conditioning was more efficient and probably more powerful as well. Whoops. Didn't mean to do that. There we go. Here is the most recent autoclaves, and I think there might have been 2 there.
Big on the left.
But you can see the cleaning is done in a whole different way than like a shop vac to vacuum up the water. It was not pushed toward a drain in the middle of the floor. Here are casualties being dropped off by a Sikorsky, which is one of the older aircraft. Walked through that gate that I pointed out a few slides back that was just to the right of the air terminal. And here's a bigger airplane dropping off casualties. And it looks like it might be a C-130. A similar airplane is a 123. Now here's triage. There were 10 patient bays in triage, and each bay was staffed by at least 2 and more often 3 Navy hospital corpsmen. And there would usually be 2 or 3 physicians. One of those physicians would be the triage officer. And when I was on duty, from approximately September on, I arrived in April, and from September on, when I was on duty, and casualties came in, I would be at the elbow of the triage officer. And the latest book I read with a fictional nurse, by the author who had talked to many Army nurses, wrote about how chaotic triage was. And that the fictional operating room, or triage, was described as chaotic and noisy, which I've no doubt that happened. I've no doubt triage from time to time might be that way. And we have to respect that was their experience. Different from their experience was my experience with these 10 operating room, or 10 triage bays where casualties would be taken care of. There was no chaos. The 3 Navy corpsmen would each have a job to do. One Navy corpsman would be cutting off the casualty's clothing. Another Navy corpsman would be starting an IV. If there was another Navy corpsman, he might be taking down information, perhaps from the wounded person himself, or from a tag he might have around his neck. And that the loudest noise I experienced in my several months of going to triage with the triage officer was the sound that the jungle boot makes on a plywood floor. It's almost drum-like. So I have no doubt that there were some triagers that were chaotic and noisy and tough to deal with. It was not part of my experience, for which I am grateful for. Let's see, we got to keep this rolling here. This is more triage. And this is operating room. The next dozen or so slides will be operating room. And this guy has a hand injury, and he might be awake, but the anesthesiologist will be here at the head of the team. Here's a doctor scrubbing in, the patient's already prepared. The doctor will help place the sterile linens, exposing just the part. This is an operating room technician. He is helping the doctor and also passing instruments. Sometimes the doctors work with just the scrub technician, or in some cases, the doctor might invite another doctor to join him, or he might ask that another technician to join him from the OR techs. And so sometimes in addition to passing instruments, the scrub tech might be tying knots that the sutures that the doctor has already put in, or he might be doing some suturing himself on the skin usually. Or he might be holding a retractor or suctioning or clamping off bleeders, that kind of stuff. Oh, this guy's name is Jim Hamlin. I can no longer remember that guy's name. Here's retractors being held by a technician. So here there's two technicians. And this guy might be a physician. And some of the bigger cases where the person is wounded in more than one place, it might be a doctor and a tech each working on the surgical site. This is a second lieutenant who was showing his platoon what not to do with primacord. Primacord is a type of fuse that is instantaneous. It's usually ignited by electricity. It could be a very small spark. It could be something that when you want it to go off, you just generate the spark that travels to electrical wires that has a blasting cap attached to the primacord, and there's an explosion. And usually the primacord is used in addition to other munitions. But this young lieutenant was showing what not to do with the primacord, and he lost fingers from both hands. So as I was saying, I would take photographs only when the ORs weren't busy. That doesn't mean the cases were minor. It just means there was a different stuff going on. And nobody ever told me not to take pictures. In fact, some of the doctors wanted photographs of before and after. Just because sometimes we had miracles, and sometimes we didn't. I meant to tell you that I might have tears, but I celebrate my tears because for 13 years I didn't have any. I had very few emotions. And part of my healing after my divorce was getting my emotions back. My first wife would tell you that I only had two emotions, happy and angry. So I celebrate my tears because I've got most of my emotions back. But emotions, there are painful emotions. So with the emotions sometimes comes the pain. And you know what? That's okay. Oh, geez, come on, let's keep this moving. Sometimes I get lost in my own eloquence. Let's see. This is a chest wound. Looks like they're doing a partial pneumonectomy, taking out part of a lung. This guy has a familiar face. That's me. This was probably taken before, well, it's hard to say. Before I took over a second command, I was usually, from April and through August, I was usually scrubbed in, or being the circulating technician, who's the guy who's not scrubbed in that opens supplies that are needed during surgery. Opening sterile supplies so they could be brought on to the field sterile. This guy I had a conversation with before he came in the operating room, and while he was in the operating room before he was prepped. And it was mostly just small talk. He asked me how he was doing, you know, if he was going to make it. And of course I lied to him. And I told him the doctor was going to open him up and fix him up inside and he'd be home in a week or two. But he was dead about 5 minutes after they opened him up because his descending aorta had 2 holes in it. And that blood pressure inside the abdominal cavity had pushed up blood and intestine surrounded by omentum through a very small hole in his abdominal cavity. And so when they opened him up, so here's probably 2 doctors and 2 technicians. I know these 2 guys are technicians. And my house mouse that washed my clothes hated it when I came back with blood on my uniform, on my boots, which was fairly often when I was scrubbed in. We're almost done with this. So as I was telling Charlie Hilliloyd behind me here, many of our doctors, I would say maybe as many as half, were men who had just recently completed their surgical residency. I think they're called something else nowadays, but in those days they were surgical residents that might have been 2 or 3 years long. And then once they completed their surgical residency in basic surgery, they might be inclined to specialize in orthopedics or ophthalmology or orthopedics, or I already said that, or plastic surgery. But, and so if they were inclined to specialize, they might talk to the orthopedic surgery and see if they could scrub in on some orthopedic type surgery, which were many. We had a lot of that. And a plastic surgeon might ask to scrub in on somebody who needed some reconstructive surgery. This is looks like a neck wound. Yeah, we didn't, there were only 2 specialties that we had at our field hospital, at least that I can remember. We had 2 orthopedic surgeons and we had 1 thoracic surgeon. And then the rest were, I know whose hands those are my hands. The rest of them would have to be called general surgeons. Oh, I meant to point out the lights in the Quonset hut are 4 operating rooms. In the Quonset huts, the surgical table was illuminated by 5 incandescent bulbs with reflectors behind them, mounted on a 4x4 piece of plywood. This is a Vietnamese woman who was shot from behind, I think simply for running away from some, it was probably Marines, and the corpsman put a hole in her throat so she could breathe, and she was brought to the operating room alive, and the wannabe plastic surgeons got out their book and did reconstructive surgery on their face and really did a wonderful job. Come on. There we go. It doesn't quite do it justice, but it's really quite well done. Unfortunately, she, after about 4 days in intensive care, she was declared brain dead because during the early part of her injury, she was not getting oxygen to her lungs because of obstructed airway. But this is typical of what the flora looked like. And this is typical of what going home looked like. This Pan Am jet staffed by Pan Am stewardesses, which is what they were called in those days. And we were on the tarmac waiting for our plane to come for approximately 2 hours. And on April 21st of 1968, which was my rotation date back to the States, it was probably only 100 degrees on the tarmac. And then our plane arrived and we had to wait for all the new guys getting off, and then had to be refueled and reprovisioned for our in-flight meals. And so it was probably 3 hours before we got on board. And once we all got seated, the stewardesses passed out wet washcloths that were warm. And what a relief that was to wash your face and your hands with your wet washcloth. But when I looked at my washcloths, it was brown, just from the dust of the tarmac and so forth. And this is military money, military payment certificates. We were not allowed to have any U.S. currency. And these are just some bullets of what was being used. This is AK-47. This bullet is from the 1911 Colt, and there's a M16 and the 7.62 round and the 50 caliber. Lights up. I have a few things to say, just a little bit. When people back in the 70s and 80s started talking about PTSD and were identifying it, for a long time I knew they weren't talking about me because I was never in combat. And it took me a long time it took a psychologist to say, and it was the second of 3 psychologists that I've seen since 1968. It took a psychologist to say, you were in the operating room. Of course you had PTSD. So it's been a long time to get here today, but every time I show people and talk to people, sometimes it's very difficult, but at the end I'm always so happy to have done this. And I hope you got something, maybe it's a curiosity or some understanding about what it was like, different than the movie version or the television series version, or perhaps books you've read on the subject. Okay, questions?
Yeah, Bob, I was just wondering, what is the source you identified for your PTSD? Because I know you had such a tremendous constant trauma with the medical aspect of it. The actual war wasn't, I mean, you're there, it's overwhelming, it's always with you, but your everyday life was really the medical trauma.
Most of my trauma I would have to describe not so much the medical aspect, but what I knew that not only what was happening to the casualty in our operating rooms
I think I'll be all right.
would not only affect the casualty, it would affect his entire family. And his life would never be the same. His family would never be the same.
That constant overwhelming feeling of helplessness and...
I've kind of put words to it myself, which is always questionable because I'm not the brightest knife in the drawer. But I've had a hard time stopping grieving. Not only for the very few that we lost, because we over 99% of our patients that came into our operating room left alive, which is, that's good. But I grieve for the patients and their families. And once they left the operating room, I never knew what happened to them. I knew that the woman died because intensive care was also anesthesia recovery, and so I could go in there and see how she was doing. I wanted her to live, just because the docs did such a wonderful job on her face, and I felt so bad that she got in the line of fire or some GI shot her just because she was running away. Anyhow, was my answer in there anyway?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Robin?
Go ahead.
Just first, thank you for sharing this really a personal piece of history of something we've heard about, but never in the weeds like this.
Yeah.
But watching some of the pictures that you took, I found myself like my breath catching, oh my God. And it's just a picture I'm looking at. You were there day in, day out.
Yeah.
And it was just never ending for a year.
Yeah.
So you have to shut yourself down somehow, I'm sure. You had to shut down your emotions to just get through it.
I understand the mechanism completely. There was no time to allow yourself to focus on what you really might feel.
So you're gunny sacked.
The sadness, the compassion you might want to say to the man's family or say to him. Anyhow, it's hard to describe. But there's just no time for emotions because it's going to get in your way. And that's the rationale that I've made for myself. And it was so hard to get that back because I didn't realize what had happened to me. The thought that I could come back changed. There's so many parts of me because I graduated from high school up here, which is another story. But I wanted to get back to my life that I had before I went in the service, or especially before I went to Vietnam. And so, even before I left the service, I had already asked Karen to marry me. And Who knows Karen Johnson? Come on.
I do.
There you go. Anyhow. Yeah, there's a sadness. And it's very hard to stop grieving. Anyway. But it's, grieving is just one of the many emotions, and that's one that has pain to it. And so it's not bad to feel that pain, because you got your emotion back, and that's a good thing. Anything else? Who wants to know why I'm still angry? Come on. You don't want to know? Okay, thank you. That's the line. In Vietnam, or post-Vietnam, in 1987, I was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is the most common diagnosis for people who have been exposed to Agent Orange. Okay? One of the elements of Agent Orange was not even a defoliant. It was dioxin. Dioxin by itself is not a defoliant. It's a byproduct of production. And when Roundup, a defoliant, is produced in the United States, it is tested by the Environmental Protection Agency, I hope, for its dioxin content. And there's a limit on how much dioxin can be in defoliant purchased in the United States. But when those contracts were signed by Monsanto and
Dow.
who?
Dow.
Dow, thank you. I've got help here.
That's good.
When those contracts were signed, they were for an enormous amount of product. And because that product would not be sold in the United States or even used in the United States, it would be used in a country far away that was populated by little brown people, which Monsanto and Dow and our government don't care about. And to get that volume of product made, they turned up the heat to produce a large amount in a short period of time, which increases the profit, of course. And the byproduct dioxin is, as I said, a byproduct. Happens when you heat those chemicals together. And you raise the temperature, you raise the dioxin content, and Becky, was it 400 times?
Yeah, 300 to 400 times higher in concentration in Agent Orange than what was allowed by the EPA to be sold in the U.S.
So I'm still angry about that those contracts were made knowing that dioxin was a carcinogen, and nobody lost a paycheck, nobody lost their job, nobody went to jail. 2 companies lost half of 1 year's profit. A one-time payment, half of 1 year's profit, which was in the billions, to be sure. And I'm mad that nobody went to jail. I'm mad that nobody lost a paycheck.
May I ask you a question? Would you tell the people why you walked across the United States from California to the shores of Maryland?
In 2010, I walked across the United States, and I will first say that my brother made me do it. In 2010, in January 20th of 2010, the Supreme Court decided that corporations should have constitutional rights. We all have constitutional rights that are innate, which means we were born with the constitutional rights. And nobody can take these away from us, although some people try from time to time. But when corporations have constitutional rights, they suffer no consequence because they are not living persons. In spite of what the government says, they are persons entitled to constitutional rights. But they don't suffer the consequence that human beings do when they do wrong. And so it's very hard to hold corporations accountable. And corporations are the legal entity that stand between legal consequences and human beings. Because of corporations, there'll be no human being found guilty when corporations do crime. So that was the Supreme Court's decision of Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. And my brother saw the damage that does to a democracy when corporations can't be held to account. Or not the corporations. When the human beings that stand for that manage corporations can't be held for account, they can give as much money as they want to any political entity in any amount. So that's not a good thing. And my brother saw that, and he said he was so damn mad he was going to cross the country waking people up. And he wanted to do it in a large group so that the group would walk across the country, and there'd be always somebody walking and people resting, and you could cross the country in about 3 weeks. But after a couple months of trying to get people together, he decided I was the only people he was going to get together. And so he said, I'm going to cross the country and I want you to come with me. And me being the adventure junkie that I am, I said, yeah, I'd go with it. And so on May 16th, we put our feet in the Pacific Ocean at Golden Gate Park. And we walked across the Golden Gate Bridge going north. Because the Golden Gate Bridge has the only walkway of all of the bridges out of San Francisco, a pedestrian walkway. So anyhow, and we did walk across the country, and we arrived in Ocean City, Maryland on October 26th and put our feet in the Atlantic Ocean, and then we drove home. But did it affect? Laird and I talked to thousands of people because an organization called Move to Amend set up some rallies for us or some speaking engagements, usually in the state capitol that we were going through. But my brother would, they also had people looking up media outlets through the small towns we were going to, and another person was writing press releases telling these small media outlets that the Monahan brothers were walking through their city and going on across America. And so we got interviewed by small radio stations and small television stations and newspapers, local newspapers. The big corporation outlets, big media, they didn't want to share our story because big corporations own those, and we don't talk about anything bad about corporation. It doesn't make the print. Although, who remembers Faye Whitbeck?
Yay.
Faye Whitbeck did an interview with my brother and did a wonderful article that was published in the media of the day, the Daily Journal. Yeah. Yeah, she did a great job.
Well, thank you.